Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Bronx River Sound Shore speaker program on how genetics is redefining bird classification with Ricky Flamio. My name is Leslie Brill. I'm the chapter president, and we're so happy to see you all here today and really honored and excited for Ricky to be with us to do this very interesting program that we've been looking forward to. Let me just switch something here. Okay, I am going to tell you a bit about Ricky. Ricky Flamio, PhD, is a current board member of Bronx River Sound Shore Audubon. He is a geneticist with a PhD in zoology. Dr. Flamio's PhD dissertation focused on the conservation of endangered sturgeons, and his postdoctoral work involved the production of the wood stork genome. Dr. Flamio previously worked in Manhattan at Hospital for Special Surgery and Weill Cornell Medical College, where he used his genetic background to study lupus, an autoimmune disease that causes chronic inflammation and multi-organ tissue damage in those afflicted. As of January, he's an assistant professor of biology at Dominican University in Rockland County, where he also has an evolution lab. And Ricky enjoys mentoring the next generation of scientists. And I'll also add that he's a terrific birder. So, without further ado, I'm going to change this to speaker view, turn it over to Ricky. Yay.
Thank you so much, Leslie. And thank you for the board for having me and all of you guys for listening. Let me get this so I can share. Okay. Leslie, is that okay?
Yep. Yep, that looks great. Thanks.
Sweet. Okay, guys. So today I'm going to be talking about, my talk is titled Splitting Feathers, How Genetics is Redefining Bird Classification.
I'm sorry, Ricky, excuse me. I'm very sorry to interrupt. There's a little a screen with my name on it blocking the title slide. Maybe that can be X'd out.
Yeah, let me see.
Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. Let me see. I can do, no.
I didn't see it when we were testing. There we go. Fantastic. Thank you.
Perfect. So I'm going to be talking today about speciation and what makes a species through an avian lens. And here's our website for our Audubon group, and on it we have our programs, our field trips, and our community outreach. So I implore you to check that out. It's a great group. We do Lower Westchester above the Bronx, so Mount Vernon, New Rochelle, Bronxville, Eastchester, Tuckahoe, Scarsdale. Maybe I'm missing a few, but that might be it. So what is a species? Actually, is it okay if sometimes we unmute and people can be a little interactive?
Sure, if that works for you.
Yeah. So does anybody want to guess what a species is?
Feel free to unmute and take a guess. Or raise your hand or something. Don't all jump at once.
It's okay if not. I just want to, if you have a question or you want to, chime in at any point, this is for your learning. So,
okay, I'll jump in, and I'm gonna warn you all, I haven't taken a biology class in far too many moons. But I think it's when two members of that species can produce a fertile offspring, but well, let me see. So that defines two members that are a species. But okay, so that was all I can remember from my biology class.
Thank you, Gil. Yeah, so it's kind of hard to define because what I'm going to show you throughout this PowerPoint is that I'm going to show you different ways we classify species, and then I'm going to show you different ways that birds defy this. So what is a species? Is it a bird that looks different? I mean, we have yellow-shafted and red-shafted woodpeckers, but we still call them the same species. When do we make the distinction that they're not the same species? How about a bird that sings different? It looks the same, but they sound different. Is that a species? What about a bird that can't breed with another species? Well, we have plenty of birds like swans, ducks, geese that are very distantly related. Yes, yet they still produce fertile offspring. So do we just call all ducks one species? So it's kind of hard to define what a species is. So the traditional definition is exactly what Gail was saying, which is the biological species concept. This is that a species is a group of organisms, in our case birds, that cannot interbreed, or if they do breed, their offspring are not fertile. So for example, a lot of times we think of a horse and a donkey. A horse and a donkey make a mule, but a mule is infertile. So we would say a horse and a donkey are different species. However, there's a lot of birds that when they do breed, their offspring still are fertile. So do we still call them not species? Some really obvious examples of what are a species is I don't think that anybody would be kidding me if they're trying to tell me an ostrich and a hummingbird are the same species. I mean, is there anyone here that disagrees that an ostrich is a species that's different than the hummingbird? That's pretty apparent. The common ostrich is the largest species of bird. It can be up to 350 pounds. The bee hummingbird is the smallest species of bird, and this weighs less than a penny. So I think that there's some organisms that are so different that we can clearly say those are species. But what about others? On the left, you have the blue jay. For those of you that live in the U.S., a lot of us live in the eastern U.S. We have the blue jay. This is the common blue bird that flies around in our backyards. And then on the right, in parts of Texas, we have the green jay. Well, a few years ago, they found this middle bird. What is that? That's a hybrid between a blue jay and a green jay. Very clearly, the one on the left and the one on the right are different species. They separated 8 million years ago. But they produced the one in the middle, and the one in the middle is a fertile individual. So if we were to follow the biological species concept, that the offspring is not fertile, that would mean that the blue jay and the green jay are the same species. And I don't know about you, but that's kind of hard for me to comprehend. I don't think I would call the blue jay and the green jay the same species. Mm-hmm. So we have to allow hybridization to a certain degree. So what is a species? Well, that's what we're trying to explore. How about these two? Here's a classic example for us Eastern birders. So in the yellow, I have it color coded. Is that more white bird? That's the golden winged warbler. And in the blue box with that blue range is that yellow bird. That's the blue winged warbler. We call these different species. They sound different. They look dramatically different. Yet they share almost 100% of their DNA. So where is the line? They look totally different. They produce hybrids. Their hybrids produce hybrids. So are these one species? Is it two species? What is this? How about these? So I'm sure a lot of you, even for my non-bird folks, you've seen the mallard duck, the leftmost picture. You've seen that in common ponds. In that first picture, you have the greenhead duck and the brownhead duck. That's the same species. The greenhead is the male and the brownhead is the female. These breed with another duck that's on the right called the American black duck. And if you look, the female mallard and the American black duck, they don't look that different. And we now know that these two species breed, and they breed a lot, and their hybrids breed. So are those different species? Based on genetic analysis down below, for a really long time, up until about the 2010s, we thought there was only one species of ostrich. But now, look, studying the DNA, we've actually found that some of the ostriches that live in the Horn of Africa, they're also known as the blue-necked ostriches. Those are called Somali ostriches. So now we have two species of ostrich. And then recently, I know a lot of you birders, you may have been upset when you lost a species or two with the lumping. For a long time, we had 3 species of redpoll: the common redpoll, the lesser redpoll, and the hoary redpoll. And if you look at the difference in the pictures, 2 of the species of redpoll looks really different. You have the common redpoll on the left, browner back, red on the throat. And then you had the more northern hoary redpoll. They look very different. In actuality, the committee recently put them as just one species, because when they looked at the genetics, what I have here on the right, they only differ in one area of one chromosome. In all the DNA in their body, they only differ in this one key region, and that's the region that controls for colored pattern. But besides that, the rest of their DNA is equal. And so based on this, the committee decided that this is one species, and we had something called lumping. Does anyone have any questions? If not, I'm going to continue.
Hello, Sandy.
Yeah.
I'll just say amazing so far. Terrific, so interesting. Keep going.
Thanks. Does anybody, so I'm gonna go on with my argument about what is a species, but does anyone want me to go in particular why these are different species or why this is not a species, or we can go back at it at the end? Because I've looked into all of them.
Ricky, what does the offspring of the black duck and the mallard look like? Or do the males have the green head? Or are they just kind of a mixture of the two?
I think that maybe one of our other members knows this better. I can answer this in genetic terms. In terms of what it looks like, I think you have to. So if the American black duck, the hybrids usually look like an American black duck, but then the back tail will have like a curl in its feathers.
Oh, okay.
If it, yeah.
Sandy, I can speak to that. Are you okay? I recently, in eBird, I got called out because I called called an American black duck, and I got called out from the eBird police saying it was really a hybrid. And when I looked at my pictures, there was a slight amount of green in the head of the American black duck, and somebody caught me and said that that was really a hybrid because you could see a slight. And I didn't look at the tail. I go back from what you said. I'll go back and look at the tail, but there was a slight amount of green in the head.
Yes, I believe it's both.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then let's just go back one. Now that we're on the topic of, so these, right? This is also, we're going to go into different species concepts, but based on who you ask, these would be either 2 species or 1 species. And these, I think that mostly everyone can agree these are 2 different species. Just because something breeds every once in a while. This is a good example, like lions versus tigers, right? Can anyone disagree with me that lions and tigers are different species? So okay, lions and tigers, they produce an offspring called a liger. And actually, female ligers are fertile. And so based on this concept, if we were to follow this traditional definition, because female ligers are fertile, we would say lions and tigers are the same species. And I think mostly everyone would disagree with that statement. Why? Because of their appearance, because of how evolutionary different they are, because of their habitat, because of their voice. And then this is actually what we're doing now. We're doing this total evidence approach, but I'll get back to that. Okay, let's continue with the PowerPoint. So some of this to understand how do we define a species is what makes a species? How do species speciate? The dominant way that species speciate is there's some type of geographic barrier. So if you look at this diagram on the top, we have an original population. In that population, we have they're the same species. We have some fish with orange tails and some fish with yellow tails. This just shows that there's genetic diversity within the parent population. And then if we follow on the left, maybe the lake dries up a little bit. And some of the fish get trapped on the left and some of the fish get trapped on the right. What happens over time is on the left, yes, there could have been an orange-tailed fish, but most of them might have been yellow-tail. And on the right, most of them are orange-tail. And what happens is over many, many generations, you build up more genetic differences because you're separated. And we call that allopatric speciation. And so even if you were to raise the water levels and the two fish were able to be in contact with each other again, over millions of years, so many genetic differences have built up that they're not able to breed anymore. This is the same thing how we have speciation when something gets washed up on an island from the mainland, or when there's a mountain range that separates two different things. Maybe the plants on the left side of the mountain range are a different species than on the right side. This has to do with some type of geographic isolation. And then on the right, a different way that we can form species is something called it's called sympatric speciation. This has no geographic barrier. What happens is in a common environment, you have a population that has different traits. And there might be some mutation that might make some of the, that might have some type of benefit. And what ends up happening is, if you have this is something where there's no barrier. And so if you have a population that has yellow tails and orange tails, eventually you might have something called sexual selection, where the yellow tails might prefer to breed with the other yellow tails, and the orange tails might prefer to breed with the other orange tails. And when they do this, they're also selecting for other traits. And so over time, even though they had lived in the same environment, they separated themselves based on different traits that they found evolutionarily beneficial. So now that we talked about how do species speciate, either because there's some type of geographic barrier or there's some type of reproductive mechanism in which they don't breed with one another. And I want to say that this reproductive isolation doesn't need to be it doesn't need to be something like physical color. It could be a sound. Perhaps some of the female species of the orange-tailed, they prefer how some of the other fish make a different sound than the yellowfish. Or maybe they build a nest in a more safe area. It's any type of sexual selection is any type of selection where some of the population says, hey, that one might be doing it better. Let me invest in breeding with that type because their evolutionary strategy looks strong. And so that's what might happen. So when is a species a species? So on the bottom, we have a parent species. And then you have some type of barrier. It could be a physical barrier. It could be some type of sexual selection or reproductive barrier. And over time, the populations that are separated start to get more genetic differences, more than was just in the beginning. And what happens is if they're separated long enough, they form two different species that even if you were to put them back in contact with another, they wouldn't breed. Does anyone have any questions? We're okay?
So
What
yeah,
I-
I have a question. So you're saying the definition is if they don't breed, they're a species?
No, I didn't get to a definition yet.
Oh, okay.
Yes,
Not being able to breed is critical, is part of it.
no.
No, sorry. Okay.
So what I'm showing you how a species becomes a species, and then we're going to go through the definition, but there is no definition. So I'm going to get to the point that we categorize things to make our lives easier. But in actuality, when we look at this diagram, speciation is a process. And that's why we have some species that are clearly species, like ostrich and hummingbird. They definitely cannot breed with each other. But if we have some stuff like our bean goose or our ducks, they haven't gone through the speciation process as long. And so they don't have enough changes for reproductive isolation. And so the less time you have to build up the speciation, the more you're able to hybridize. Does that clear it up a little bit?
So there's a speciation spectrum, sort of.
Yes, it's a continuum.
Very
And this has to do with us humans finding it absolutely necessary to categorize things. Species is a spectrum. For example, I would say these two, I think, are very speciated. I would say these are more closely related. Would we ever expect to find a hybrid between this? I don't think this would be even possible. And then here, right, these are very closely related. So these are much, they only speciated about 1 million years ago. So these are much younger on the speciation track. Again, these are pretty early on the speciation track. The other thing that can happen, which I'm going to show you with the bean goose. Oh, that's right here. Okay, perfect. So here you have the parent species, and over time you build up a lot of different genetic differences that make you more and more able to fit into a species. However, sometimes during this genetic divergence, you raise the water too quickly. Right? So you have your pond, with all your fish, and then you lower the water. So now you have fish on either side of the pond. If you make those fish go all back together into one group before they fully speciated, they can breed again together. We call that secondary contact. And that's what's happened with our bean goose complex. Are you familiar with like the bean goose complex, tundra bean goose, taiga bean goose, pink-footed goose?
Now, I only know that there was a bean goose out on Long Island on a rare bird thing, and I, of course, never made it out there, but I was curious. First time I heard of a bean goose. That's all I know.
Yes, the famous bean goose.
Yeah, so this is mostly the bean goose. So there are 3 species of bean goose in the answer complex. We call this the bean goose complex. And so these are primarily European birds that we get as vagrants or as rare visitors into the Northeast United States in the winter. And what we have is we have 3 species of bean goose. We have the pink-footed goose, which has these really cool pink feet, and they tend to be a little smaller. They're actually very good looking in person. I went in New Jersey. I went right over to George Washington, and they had one right there last winter. Then you have this tundra bean goose and this taiga bean goose, which a lot of birders really go crazy about. And these are the ones that are even more rare to see on the East Coast. And so what happens is, in the field, it's really difficult to tell the difference between the tundra bean goose and the taiga bean goose. I mean, they look very, very similar. And what happens is when the scientists, when they looked at the DNA of these species, they actually found that the tundra bean goose and the taiga bean goose were really, really genetically similar. And so what happened was, what they ended up finding out is if you look at this evolutionary relationship on the bottom right, we call that a phylogeny or a phylogenetic tree. The way to read this tree is you read it from the left to the right. The left is the ancestor of the bean goose. On the top, you have the tundra bean goose. As a species, it became a species first, and the taiga bean goose and the pink-footed goose, they share a common ancestor. So the taiga bean goose and the pink-footed goose are related to each other more closely than the tundra bean goose. But then you do the genetics and you say, but when I do the genetics, the tundra bean goose and the taiga bean goose are more closely related. So here's the problem. We know that taiga bean goose and the pink-footed goose have a great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparent, but they're more distantly related to the tundra bean goose. If we know that's the truth, why is there more DNA shared between the tundra and the taiga? Anyone want to take a guess? It's on the slide, but I'd like to hear it from someone else's words. So what's happening is that there's something called secondary contact. And so basically, while these things were speciating, the environment or whatever was separating them didn't give them enough time to become independent species. And so they started breeding with each other. And now what you end up having is the tundra bean goose and the taiga bean goose have a lot of shared DNA because of hybridization. And so there's some scientists that are arguing that we should just call them the same species. What's the problem with calling the tundra bean goose and the taiga bean goose the same species? Any guesses?
Ricky, this is Jeff Zuckerman. Listen, I don't know the answer, but I can tell you you're getting about as good a response as I used to get when I used to teach.
It's okay. My students know that I go up on the board and I draw a lot. So my normal way of lecturing is with a marker. But basically, so this would be really weird to call tundra bean goose and taiga bean goose a species, because if you call them a species, you have to put pink-footed goose in that species. What I'm basically saying is we cannot collapse this into two species, bean goose and pink-footed goose. You can't do that. Because if you see taiga bean goose is more closely related to pink-footed goose. So if you were to make two species, if you were to say the two bean goose is one species and pink-footed goose is another, you can't do that.
And why can't you do that?
You can't do that because in phylogenetics and in some of the evolutionary terms, we only name things that are what we call a monophyletic clade, which means you can only name things that all share the same common ancestor.
Okay.
And so what's happening here, if we say tundra bean goose and taiga bean goose are one species, that won't work because taiga bean goose shares a common ancestor with pink-footed goose. So the only thing you can do here is call all three species one species. And a lot of people don't want to do that because the pink-footed goose looks a lot different.
What about the genetics, Ricky, between the pink-footed and the taiga?
Yes, so that's a good question. So the pink-footed goose was actually one of these bean goose ancestors that got stuck in Iceland. So the pink-footed goose is a very I wouldn't say inbred, but it was almost like one of these bean goose that got stuck in Iceland and then had very low genetic diversity. And so it developed these pink feet. And the thing is pink-footed goose, there's actually a lot of DNA that's similar between taiga and tundra, but that's because they hybridize, because they live in the same area. So taiga bean goose and pink-footed goose, at the genes that look at the evolution, they're very similarly related. And that's how we know that they're more closely related. But when you look at the genes that have been hybridized, that's where things get muddy.
So you're saying that the taiga has really, because the pink-footed was isolated over time, the taiga has drifted more, so to speak, towards the tundra because of the hybridization that's happened after.
In Northern Europe.
Yeah.
Yes. After
Okay.
after speciation. Exactly. And so this is something that we wrestle with. When is a species a species? When do we draw the line? If something was a species in the past, but now it's hybridizing because of climate change or range expansion, is it no longer a species? I mean, these are big questions, and this is kind of why birding is fun, because I mean, there's really no right answer. I think a lot of people would be upset if this became one species and we got rid of pink-footed goose. Because pink-footed goose is very different. And a long time ago, tundra bean goose and taiga bean goose were very different as well. But because they hybridize now, they're not as different. So did they become one species? I mean, that's really up to all of you to judge.
Well, I went with my sister. We chased down a pink-footed goose when she was here over a Thanksgiving. We finally arrived where it was, and somewhere in northern, I don't know what county, miles away, at 4:30 when it was getting dark, to get our pink-footed goose. And I don't want anybody to take that away from me. So no, don't add.
Exactly. And when you look at the genetic difference, if you look at the evolutionary genes, pink-footed goose is a different species than the other two. But the other two have a hard time with those genes because of the recent hybridization. So does that mean we should collapse it all into one species? It's kind of a weird business.
What are
But
the top people saying about all this? I mean, I
that
don't know
you,
who they are
that you
even.
should that you
You.
should that you should keep that you should keep the three separate.
Well, the birders would like to keep people separate if you got your list.
Yeah. So the best is probably to keep them separate and just be cognizant. It's very hard to ID these in the field because they had secondary contact or they had hybridization after they speciated. I mean, here I have the breeding range right on the top here. I mean, taiga bean goose is in blue, tundra bean goose is in red. Pink-footed goose you don't see on this map because they're all in Iceland. So you could see how these two get confused. They breed right next to each other.
Ricky, I just want to mention we have a couple of questions from Holly in the chat. The first one may already have been answered. It says, would it be crossbreeding between the taiga that I'm not sure if taiga is meant there, between the taiga and the tundra. And the second question is, and maybe you were planning to get to this later or maybe not, is there a despeciation model?
Yes, exactly. Thank you. I just got excited. So the crossbreeding, so when we say crossbreeding, I guess this could be crossbreeding. Crossbreeding we normally talk about for like strains of things or different breeds, like breeds of dogs, strains of peas. For here, we would call it hybridization, or we use another term called introgression for things that are more speciated. And then in terms of despeciation, exactly. So what's actually happening between the tundra and taiga bean goose is a process we call genetic assimilation. And it's when you previously had two things that made good species, and based on hybridization, they start looking like one species. Not in this case, but a lot of times this happens if you have two closely related species and one is endangered and one is not. What happens is the endangered species doesn't have a lot of mates to pair with. So it starts mating with the species that looks enough like it. Does everyone understand what I'm saying?
Yep.
Yeah.
So if there's an endangered species and another species that's more common, if they're closely related and the endangered species starts having a hard time finding things like it, it will start mating with things that are good enough. And what happens is over time, its DNA, because of the breeding, it starts breeding more and more with what is good enough, and then its DNA is lost, in more generations. We call that genetic assimilation or genetic swamping. And at that point, we no longer have that species. So that is totally possible.
Ricky, there was an article in the New York Times a few days ago about different species of birds preening each other. Do you think that has any relation to this? If you've
It could.
seen
I
it.
would need to know what species. So that could be two things. One, it could be maybe they're close enough related, or second, maybe just like little birds that preen rhinoceroses. There's just some type of shared social benefit between different organisms helping each other.
Mm-hmm.
Like the one species of bird preening or cleaning the other bird, yes, you could see it as the other bird gets its parasites taken off, but the other bird benefits as well because it gets food. So is it helping it because it wants to breed, or is it helping it because it's getting food? There's a couple different ways. It definitely it's a species by species context. That's why. But like when you think of those two different species, preening each other, but then you take it, well, what if one of those species is a rhino We don't think the rhino and the bird are going to breed, but there might be some type of shared benefit. One of the birds gets food and the other bird gets cleaned.
Yes, I think they were pointing to them as unusual examples of cooperation. Thank you.
Yes. All right. Thank you, guys. So I'm going to go on to the next slide. So every October, we have something called the eBird taxonomy update. So for my non-birders, eBird is the list that we go by to what are all of the, it's our bird checklist. It's almost like playing Pokemon, but in real life. And we have a couple different terms. One of them is called a split. A split is when we have one species, such as a bean goose, and then we split it based on evidence. And I'm going to talk to you about that evidence. We split it into 2 or 3 different species, or 4 or 5. That's a split, when we make new species from one. Then there's other things called lumps. Lumps are when, kind of like these red poles, when we had different species and then we do the genetics and we say, actually, they're just different colors of the same species. And that's a lump. We also have renames. So we either rename something to more closely resemble what it looks like. And we also reclassify things. As we do more DNA or morphology testing, we say, actually, that bird is more closely related to that bird, and we need to put them in the same bird family. So how does where does the eBird taxonomy, how does it change? Well, first of all, there's committees like the American Ornithological Society or different other committees in North America, South America, that vote if a species, if a certain bird should have species status. They vote every year. And what they do is they look at many years of research. They use a total evidence approach. They say, well, what does the genetics, say about this? How different are they? Also, do they have different songs? Because that's a form of reproductive isolation. Are they different colors? Do they live in different habitats? Does one of them live in the eastern US and one of them live in the western US? So they just don't go by one thing. They take a total evidence approach, and that's how they decide what's a species. So for example, if we were to go back, to these blue wing and golden wing warblers, yes, their DNA is very similar, but they have different ranges, very different colors. Where they don't overlap in range, they don't interbreed. They have very different songs, and they live in very different habitats. And so because of all of these things, they usually don't take one piece of evidence as the definition. So yes, they share a lot of their DNA, but when they look at their other things, behavior, morphology, ecology, geography, they don't find it compelling enough to say that they're the same species. There are habitat, there are color, there are sound, there are breeding differences that still warrant them as different enough evolutionarily units. I'm going to get back to, okay, so we have many years of research. Then every year the committees vote. eBird is based on something called the Clements checklist. And so eBird taxonomy updates whenever the Clements checklist changes. And actually, so we have a couple fragmented committees right now saying how many bird species do we have in the world? But we're actually moving towards a global checklist called AV-List. And so in the near future, this process is going to be much more global, much more inclusive, and much more universal. So I already kind of got to this part. Modern taxonomists, the people, and especially these people that are voting on the committee, is this a species or not a species, are using this total evidence approach. So I'm sure a lot of people that have birded a lot of the US, in October, you gained many species, and one of them was the western versus the eastern warbling vireo. Yes, they have very subtle physical differences, but the main thing is they have very different sounds. And so this was one of the evidences. They were genetically different. They live in different parts of the US. And so they took a couple of the different things and they said, okay, this is a species. Another thing I just want to introduce you guys to this topic called cryptic species. I was going to talk about our flycatchers, but let's just talk about the titmouses. Basically, these are cryptic species. Can anyone see anything different between the oak and the juniper titmouse at first glance? Or does it look kind of difficult? It looks kind of difficult. And so cryptic species are species that look physically indistinguishable or like really hard to physically tell apart. But when you look at their genetics, they're very different. And they also don't tend to breed in the wild. And you might say, okay, maybe they have different ranges. But we know, I mean, those ranges are different ranges, but we know that there are vagrants or migrating birds all the time. If they wanted to breed together, they could, but they don't. And the reason is because they have different sounds, they have different habitats, they have different behaviors that tell them, oh, that's not my species, even though they look the same. So a lot of times, the only way to tell this is by studying these ecology metrics, like habitat, and also studying the DNA. So even though these physically look very similar, DNA-wise, they're very different. And then I just want to go back to that speciation gradient. Remember we said there are different things at different points of speciation? Well, take our common grackle. In northern New York, we have the bronze grackle. In Florida, we have the purple grackle. And in between, they kind of look like a mix of the two. So maybe at some point, these species were separated and now they're coming back. I mean, these are subspecies. Maybe they didn't have enough time to speciate. And so they are not quite species, but they look kind of different or they have different DNA. We call those subspecies. And so what's the future of taxonomy? Well, I already said that there's going to be AV list, which is the global avian checklist. This is a global committee and unified checklist that's going to come out in the near future. And species are going to continue to be split and lumped. And why is this? It's because we don't have any universal rules. We don't have any universal rules for birds. We don't have any universal rules for any animals. And it's hard to make the rules. Do you say because it's because of percent DNA similarity? I don't think so, because then you have species that were separated a long time ago, but now a lot of their DNA looks the same because they hybridized recently. And some of that could have been because of climate change. Or something where species were separated before, but now because it's warmer, one of the species can now live in a different environment. What about different habitats? I mean, our environment is constantly changing. So we can't say this is a species because it lives here and not over there. Finally, I want to end with Classification is messy, but it's necessary. As humans, we classify things because it makes us easier for us to communicate ideas, communicate science, and to study organisms. This allows us to have conservation priorities and say, this lineage of endangered thing needs to be protected. We need to be able to talk to one another. And if we just group everything as one thing, it's very hard to make any type of conservation decisions. This also increases our scientific understanding of, how does the world work? Where do species come from? Where do we come from? And the fun part, it also allows us to keep birding lists. So I took this picture yesterday. This is my current species observed. And so, yeah, this is my eBird page. So I'd like to just thank the board and the audience for listening to me. I'd like to thank my family, my friends, my students, my family and friends that allow me to bird when we travel, be it I'm on a bachelor party or something, I'm still going on my own and birding. And then Leslie did say, here's my paper for the wood stork genome. And if anyone wants to check out my Flamio lab, my lab at Dominican, here's the link.
Ricky, thank you so much. What a fantastic presentation. Truly thought-provoking concepts, and I love the interactive format. Maybe we should do that from now on. I'm usually scurrying around trying to mute barking dogs and clinking silverware, but when you allow everyone a chance to interact, suddenly you don't hear any of that, and people are jumping in asking questions, and I love that. Really wonderful. I got a lot out of that presentation. Does anyone have any questions?
Can I answer Alicia's question from the chat?
Sure.
A very good question. So Alicia wrote, if the DNA is more similar between the tundra and taiga, how do we know the pink-footed goose and the taiga share a common ancestor? So yeah, I read a bunch of papers about this. So actually there's it's all through modeling, all through computer modeling. And so what you can do is you can find these different hotspots in the genome that show where they were evolutionarily different and where they share and so you can see different DNA hotspots in the genome that are evidence of evolution versus evidence of hybridization. And that's how they do it. They do it with a lot of computer modeling. And that's how they were able to come up with those hypotheses. You look at how the chromosomes mix, how they match, how they cross over genes, things like that. It's computational and genetic modeling. And when they look at the patterns in the genomes, that's how they come up with those conclusions.
So all brings us to AI. Can't get away from AI. Is AI gonna make a difference in all this? It's gonna figure out everything for us?
Absolutely not, because I mean, when you get into this type of biology, AI is very wrong.
I agree.
It's very wrong. It's very specific. AI will only give you what it has seen before. And if you're on the cutting edge of science, it has not seen that before. That's a human mind. And so it can't train itself on something that wasn't input into it or that's not on the web.
Yeah.
So that is why. So like I was writing one review paper and it was about a very specific topic. And I'm sure if you ask AI about this specific topic, they'll get most of it wrong. They have nothing to build it on.
Okay. So Ricky, are there, I think when you think about birds and obviously the way they migrate, the way they, the flying, and So they're more mobile than any other type of animal, I think. Are there other types of animals where they have where this concept of species, is this a species versus that a species? Is there any other type of animal where it's such a big part of study as, species and speciation or speciation is in birding?
Fish.
Ah, fish.
Yes, so lots of fish. That's very difficult. Normally, you have to count the scales, and even that's species for fish can be separated just by rivers that are right next to each other or creeks that are right next to each other. And if there's not enough time for those creeks to develop, um, if they haven't had enough time to have genetic differences, as soon as the creeks get flooded or something, I mean, it could be kind of a mess.
Got it. Thank you.
Ricky, I have one question. Could you
Yes, sir.
speculate on what the original bird was that led to both the hummingbird and the ostrich?
Yeah, so I was I think what happened was what was it, that documentary that was like within the last year or two, and it showed so birds came from dinosaurs. And so reptile, in evolutionary terms, reptile is a defunct term. We should not call things reptiles because it's not inclusive of birds. Because birds are avian dinosaurs, and dinosaurs are most closely related to crocodilians. So what was the original bird? The original bird was something that survived. Birds came way before the asteroid hit. And so those bird lineages survived the asteroid. And that's what developed into the ancestors of the ostrich and the hummingbird.
Good, thank you.
I'm just going to jump in and say that last year we had a speaker program titled The Evolution of Birds by Dr. Walter Jan. And please feel free to check that recording out on our website if you're interested in learning a bit more about bird evolution.
Ricky, I'm just jumping in to thank you for the great job you did. You're a wonderful teacher, and I think Dominican is really, really lucky to have you. Keep up the great work. I hope you have a long and wonderful career there. I mean that.
Thank you, Jeff.
Absolutely. Ricky still has miles to go before he sleeps. This is one of a series of lectures today. Thank you so much. We have also thank yous in the chat. And what a pleasure. If no one, does anyone else have any more questions or comments? If not, I thank you all again for being here. The recording of this will be on the website eventually, and hope to see some of you at our upcoming walks and talks. And thanks again, Ricky, and have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Good. Great job.
Yay.
Great job.
Thanks, Ricky.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you, Ricky.